Good evening. I'm Ann Masters, and I want to welcome you to the January meeting of the League of Women Voters of the Edwardsville area. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to take this opportunity to tell you that our speaker next month on the third Thursday night, it's February 15th, will be Dr. Patrick Shelton, Superintendent of our Public School District, District 7. We'll meet in person at the Manny Jackson Center in their downstairs meeting room. District 7 is providing this meeting space for us, along with the technology for Dr. Shelton's presentation. We're appreciative of this excellent meeting space, and I encourage you to bring friends and help increase the numbers in our audience to let them know how much we do appreciate his time and the meeting space. The topic will be an update on the bond election projects and any additional information Dr. Sutton wants to share with us, as well as an opportunity for us to ask any kind of questions we have of him. Our topic tonight is the Electoral College, and our speaker is Rosemary Heilemann. Rosemary is a resident of Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and far north Chicago, a retired teacher, a 45-year member of the League of Women Voters of Deerfield, Lincolnshire, and a founding member of the Inter-League Electoral College Committee. She helped form the committee in 2017 to promote attention to the long-held league position that the Electoral College should be abolished. The committee's goal is to keep this topic in the forefront of public discussion until it becomes widely accepted that an amendment is needed. The abolishment of the Electoral College is listed this year, 2024, as the fifth pillar of the campaign for making democracy work. That's the 2024 League of Women Voters of the U.S. program planning materials. We're fortunate tonight to have Rosemary's presentation of a slideshow prepared by the Electoral College Committee, which will give us both history and current importance of the issue, and also to have her comments and the opportunity to ask questions following the presentation. So again, welcome to all of you participating, and especially to Rosemary, and other member of her committee, I think, is with us also. So thank you, Rosemary, and I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And yes, I'm so happy that Toni Dautel is here with us today. She's one of the founding members of our committee, and there are a few others there behind me to give me some confidence. So we were very pleased that at the last League convention, the announcement was made that the League of Women Voters of the United States has made the abolition of the Electoral College a priority. It's been a position since 1970, as Ann mentioned, but now we have an actual nationwide campaign. So the presentation I'm giving you today is the last one of many iterations that we've put together since 2017, and it is the official one that's on the website of the League of Women Voters, as well as the brochures. I think, Ann, did you distribute those brochures to people that we sent? And so those are materials.
Some, but we also sent it out with the email promoting the evening. Mm-hmm.
The PDF version. Okay, so those materials have been officially approved by the League of Women Voters of the United States. And so that's what I'm presenting today. And Toni will help me with questions at the end. And it does have a script. So I'm going to try to stick to the script pretty much, because we are trying to encourage local leagues to also identify people who, one, might be interested in joining our committee. It's now a multi-state committee. We have attendees from all over the country that we've met at various national conventions as we were trying to get this in the attention of LWVUS, and from many leagues throughout Illinois. And we're trying to train as many as we can to give this presentation to other groups as they go out. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. And here we go. Let's see, that's what I want. All right. And I'm going to minimize this. All right, so abolishing the Electoral College by a direct popular vote. Oh, why is that not? There we go. We're going to cover these topics. I won't read them, but basically a little background and then some of the common myths and then what we think we'd like to do. So what is the Electoral College? First of all, the Electoral College is a group of 538 people, electors, they're called the electors, who elect the president and vice president of the United States every 4 years. According to the US Constitution, each state legislature gets to decide how their electors will be chosen. Now, here I'm going to veer off a little bit because I think, is what I call some of the less known features about the Electoral College. Because all of the states except Maine and Nebraska have a winner-take-all system, people seem to think that that's how it has to be. But it doesn't. And the fact that Maine and Nebraska have a different system where they have winner take all in each of their congressional districts, and then they have 2 at-large electors representing the senators, because each state has the number of electors equal to the number of seats in the House, the representatives, and the Senate. So I have some numbers here from 1804, the 1804 election. And at that time, these are the states where each elector was appointed by the state legislature: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, New York, South Carolina, and Vermont. South Carolina did not offer the vote to the people to vote for electors, to vote for president, until after the Civil War. And then the other group, each elector chosen by voters statewide, they were starting to have people vote statewide, was New Hampshire, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia. And then some of them did kind of like Maine and Nebraska do, where the state was divided into electoral districts with one elector chosen per district by the voters of that district. That was North Carolina, Maryland, and Tennessee. Kentucky divided the state into 2 electoral districts, and half the electors were chosen from each. And Massachusetts had a system where 2 electors were chosen by voters statewide. Oh, and this is what Maine and Nebraska do. And 1 elector chosen per congressional district in a statewide vote. So there's nothing that says it has to be winner take all. And the state legislatures have the power to change that. So that's one of the less known features. In the beginning of our country, as we said, the state legislatures just picked the electors themselves. Over time, states started choosing electors by popular vote within their state. Each political party has their own slate of electors. When you vote in November, you are not voting directly for a presidential candidate. You are voting for a group of state electors from the candidate's political party who have pledged to give their electoral votes to that candidate. And there have been some states over the years where you had the names of the electors that were pledged to the different candidates right on the ballot. And if you go to a primary, you will see the names on the primary ballot in Illinois. Each state gets a specific number of electors based on their congressional delegations, 1 for each U.S. senator and each U.S. representative. For example, Texas has 38 electoral votes in 2020, while Rhode Island had 4. The District of Columbia, although not a state, gets 3 electors. Importantly, the winner of the Electoral College is not whomever gets the most electoral votes. The winner must have a majority of the votes, over 50% of the votes to win. Currently, that's 270 electoral votes to win. If no candidate gets 270 votes, the U.S. House of Representatives chooses the president, with each state having just 1 vote, and the Senate chooses the vice president. And this is the second less well-known feature of the Electoral College that people tend to forget about. It's called a contingent election. And with this election coming up, you have a third-party candidate. And in the past, there have been some strong third-party candidates where there was a possibility that they might have taken votes away from enough votes in enough states to arrange it so that no one candidate got 270 votes. So if it goes into the House of Representatives in a contingent election, the whole delegation of New York, one vote. All 50 representatives in California, one vote. That guy in Wyoming, one vote. So it is so far removed from a fair and equal system that people, I think, would be horrified if we ever had a contingent election, which we could. So the League of Women Voters had developed a position in 1970. They did a study because what had happened at that time, some of you remember, George Wallace was running for president, and there was a fear that neither Nixon nor Humphrey would get enough votes, would get 270 votes to win the election, and that it would go into the House of Representatives with just what I've described. Now, it didn't come to that. Wallace didn't think he would win, but he thought he might be able to get concessions from Nixon or from Humphrey. And so the League of Women Voters did a study and adopted this position. The League of Women Voters of the United States believes that the direct popular vote method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. And in those days, at that time, Birch Bayh was a well-known senator who passed numerous amendments, and he brought an amendment into the House and the Senate, and it passed the House by a large majority, but it floundered in the Senate due to a filibuster and was not able to get through the Congress, which it has to do first before it goes to the states for ratification. So that was a big disappointment at that time. And that's what we're hoping, that maybe we can make some progress now. So what is wrong with the Electoral College? And how will a direct popular vote for president solve the various problems? So to start, we're going to go back to the very beginning, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the long, hot summer of 1787. This was just after the American rebels won independence from England, and the newborn country needed a national constitution. They were replacing the Articles of Confederation, which had not been suitable, it had too many problems, to determine how it would be governed. Each of the original 13 states could send delegates to represent them at this constitutional convention. 55 delegates attended, representing 12 of the 13 original states. The delegates included many famous men, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. These men faced the task of creating a new national system of government, and there were many fierce debates and arguments. How to elect the president was one of the first arguments to arise, and it was the last one to be resolved, through a compromise idea that ultimately came to be called the Electoral College. So if you remember your U.S. history, there were many debates and arguments and compromises in the creation of the U.S. Constitution. And one of them was the one of representation. So in the House of it was decided that each state would have 2 senators in the Senate. But in the House of Representatives, the southern states felt that they should have more representation because they wanted to count their slaves as people. And this was not seen as fair, but it was important. Every state was needed if this country was going to get off the ground. So the 3/5 compromise was made, in which enslaved persons were counted as 3/5 of a person. So slavery was one of the important background situations at the time. The Electoral College was a compromise designed to give Southern states more voting power in presidential elections based on counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person. This 3/5 compromise had already been used to increase the number of representatives given to Southern states in the U.S. House of Representatives. Because the Electoral College is based in part on the number of members that each state has in the U.S. Congress, it carried this infamous math into presidential elections. This rift between the North and South was not because there were more people living in the northern states than in the southern states. In fact, as you can see on this chart, the northern and southern states had essentially the same total population in the late 1700s, about 1.8 million people each. However, the southern states had a much smaller voting population than the northern states, because over 1/3 of the southern states' population was enslaved. As a result, the southern states adamantly refused a direct popular vote for president. Before the convention, everyone expected that there would be battles between smaller versus larger population states. But as Madison wrote about halfway through the convention, quote, "It seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interests lies not between the large and small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. If the racism of the Electoral College had ended when slavery ended, we might not be having this conversation. But the Electoral College continued to silence Black votes after the Civil War." Right after the Civil War, there was a brief period called Reconstruction, when federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce the newly won civil rights of formerly enslaved Americans. During Reconstruction, Black men voted, of course, not the women yet, and the first Black representative served in Congress. But then came the election of 1876. In this case, and I'll tell you, it was Tilden versus Hayes, but nobody had 270 votes. And 4 states, Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon, this may sound familiar, they all sent 2 sets of elector certificates, both claiming to be the official certificate. So it was a complete mess. There was no solution that seemed to be satisfying everyone. So in what we would call today a backroom deal or a smoky backroom deal, the 2 parties came up with a compromise that traded, and it was a sinister compromise. It traded the newly awarded rights of Black people to shore up the malfunctioning Electoral College. So the Republicans, remember in these days, the Republicans were the radical Republicans. They would have been, that was the party of Lincoln. And the Southerners became what we used to call the Dixiecrats. But in any event, the compromise allowed Hayes to become president, even though Tilden had actually gotten more votes and more electoral votes, but not enough, in exchange for the removal of federal troops from the South. The states of the former Confederacy were once again allowed to rule themselves. They took away all those federal troops, and they quickly started passing a series of laws commonly known as Jim Crow laws. During the Jim Crow era, the voting rights of Black people were systematically destroyed by state laws and local ordinances, like poll taxes and literacy tests. The Jim Crow era lasted for almost 100 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Electoral College was created because of slavery, and the failure of the Electoral College in 1876 allowed racism to flourish. Unfortunately, the racist impact of the Electoral College didn't end with the Voting Rights Act. The Electoral College continues to suppress the voice of Black Americans. That's because states with a higher percentage of Black residents tend to have less power in the Electoral College, while states with whiter populations tend to have more power. For this analysis, Electoral College power, I'm going to take a sip of a drink here, excuse me. For this analysis, Electoral College power is defined as the number of people it takes within a state for each electoral vote. If it takes fewer people to make up one electoral vote, the electoral power is stronger. For example, in the chart on the left, in states that are more than 85% white, it's about 400,000 people per each electoral vote. But in states that are more than 15% Black, higher than the national average, it's almost 650,000 people per electoral vote. If you do the math, dividing the two, it means that it takes 1.6 votes in states with high Black populations to equal 1 vote in states with higher white populations. This is a simple analysis based on 2020 census data. However, a more sophisticated statistical analysis done by William Black from the University of Maryland in 2019 came to the same conclusion. His analysis of every election from 2000 on indicates the Electoral College has consistently awarded more votes per capita to states with whiter populations. Again, the Electoral College may not be trying to mute Black votes, but it is having that impact simply because of how our Black and white populations are distributed across the states. And actually, in a later slide, you'll see how this imbalance of votes works because of the addition of the 2 Senate votes. Perhaps this will naturally reduce over time, but a direct popular vote would immediately eliminate this racist impact by making every voter count as 1 vote, regardless of race or any other demographic. One of the most common complaints about the Electoral College is that it turns losers into winners. A lot of people these days are not aware of the racism that's been a part of the Electoral College from the beginning, yet they are aware of other issues with the system. So what do people dislike about the Electoral College? The complaint we hear most from people is the Electoral College turns losers into winners. 5 times in our history, the Electoral College has awarded the presidency to candidates who lost the popular vote. This happened 3 times in the 1800s and twice in this century, 2016 and 2000. A direct popular vote for president would ensure that the candidate who gets the most votes from the people would actually become president. And then here's where some votes count more than others. And this is what's built into the system. It violates the principle of 1 person, 1 vote. It makes some votes count more than others, depending on where the voter happens to live. This is because the number of electoral votes given to a state isn't exactly proportional to its population. No matter how many people live in a state, it takes 2 electoral votes. It gets 2 electoral votes based on its 2 senators. So voters from smaller states have their votes weighted more heavily in the Electoral College than votes from larger states. So before I'll read the example here, what I tell people, look, California, let's say they have around 50 representatives. So now they have 50 electors, and now you give them 2 more electors to represent their 2 senators. That's not such a big increase. It's from 50 to 52 or whatever the number, it's close to that. Whereas Wyoming, which only has 1 representative because it has such a small population, and now you give them 3 electors. They get 1 for their 1 representative, and they get 2 more electors representing their 2 senators. Now that small population in Wyoming is represented by 3 electors, and so that means that fewer people are represented in each elector. So as you can see on the table, 1 vote in Wyoming counts as much as almost 4 votes in Florida. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, or 1 electoral vote for every 192,000 people. Florida is a bigger state, and it has 29 electoral votes. That's 1 electoral vote for every 743,000 people in Florida. So if you do the math, in the Electoral College, it takes nearly 4 popular votes in Florida to equal 1 popular vote in Wyoming. This plays out in other small and large state matchups like Wyoming, Vermont, or Alaska, whose electoral votes count as much as 3 or 4 votes in states like Florida, Texas, and California. A fundamental principle of the United States is that one person has one vote. This is the standard for every other election in this country, from governor to congressman to local mayors. And it should be one person, one vote in our presidential elections. And that's exactly how it would be in a direct popular vote for president. Now, regardless of all this data, we all know by now that only a few states really matter in presidential elections. These are so-called swing states, where the outcome of the vote is considered to be up for grabs. The rest of the states are considered, quote, safe states, where the feeling is that the election result is obvious. The map here shows the swing states from the 2020 election. Now, it changes from election to election. Wherever there seems to be a competitive election, that's what we would call the swing states. The top 6 swing states are in dark purple: Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. Then there were another 7 swing states shown in lighter purple. Together, these swing states got almost all the TV ads and campaign events. In fact, 100% of the TV ads and 98% of the campaign events, now not fundraisers, but campaign events for 2020, for the 2020 general election presidential campaigns were in these swing states. They get all of the candidates' attention, and even worse, that means that they may have greater influence over the candidates' policy positions. With direct election by popular vote, candidates would be forced to pay attention to the whole country, not just a handful of swing states. All 50 states and the District of Columbia would require consideration from presidential candidates. And here I'm going to stop a minute with a little something I want to say about this color purple that you see. The swing states, we consider them competitive, and as opposed to the other states that are considered safe. But don't forget, even though we use the TV uses this map of red and blue, this is a blue state, that's a red state, none of the states is completely blue or completely red. They are all various shades of purple. And this is just another kind of depressing aspect of the Electoral College. So I'm just going to randomly, I'll take Illinois, for example. So Illinois is considered a safe state. And I have here the official 2020 presidential election results. And in Illinois, Biden got 3.4 million votes, and Trump got 2.4 million votes. So that's not a landslide blue. That's definitely a shade of purple. So I'll go up here to Alabama. So Biden got 849,000 votes in Alabama, and Trump got 1.4 million. So again, that's not a completely red state. Let's look at Texas here. I could go on forever here, but Texas, supposedly a safe state for red. Trump got 5.9 million votes in Texas, and Biden got 5.3 million votes in Texas. And Florida, let's see, I'll do one more, just to point this out. So in Florida, Biden got 5.3 million votes, and Trump got 5.7 million votes. So all of our states actually are purple, and it distorts our view of what the election and what the outcome is when we are forced to look at our states as red or blue or swing. All right. Now, we're all league members, and in the League of Women Voters, our number one thing is we want everyone to vote. We tell people it's important that everyone participates in our democracy. And we are not going to tell you who to vote for, but we do want you to vote. But the Electoral College not only makes some votes matter more than others, it gives people a reason not to vote. It actually decreases voter turnout in the so-called safe states. Again, that conception that the state is one color or another. Data from the 2016 and 2020, from 2016 and 2020 prove this. In the graph, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in the so-called safe states compared to the swing states. These differences may seem small, only 6 or 7 percentage points, but that translates to 15 million registered voters in non-swing states who chose not to vote in 2016, and 22 million registered voters who chose not to vote in 2020. That's more than enough to change the outcome of a presidential election. This is a nonpartisan issue affecting both major political parties. If I'm a Republican voter in a, quote, blue state, or a Democratic voter in a, quote, red state, I feel like my vote for president never counts, so why bother? On the flip side, Republican voters in red states and Democratic voters in blue states feel like their party doesn't really need their vote, so why bother? So millions of people just don't vote. A direct popular vote for president will increase voter turnout by making every vote count and count equally. The swing states in 2016 included Colorado, Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And in 2020 included Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, another thing that would be difficult to evaluate, but is pretty obvious when you think about it, as we saw during the 2020 election and its aftermath, the Electoral College also leaves our presidential elections more vulnerable to manipulation and even outright fraud. The Electoral College provides partisan operatives with a roadmap for overturning election results. In 2020, that created a desire to, quote, find an additional 38 electoral votes instead of over 3.5 million votes if the winner were chosen by popular vote. And the Electoral College showed where it would be easiest to gain those electoral votes by, quote, finding fewer than 43,000 ballots in just 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That's all it would have taken to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. So those are the 6 major problems with the Electoral College, and each of them would be fixed by using a direct popular vote to elect the president. You may be convinced, but not everybody is. After all these problems with the Electoral College, we hear from some folks who say, well, even if all of this is true, here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. We'd like to walk through some of the most common reasons why people continue to support the Electoral College. And these are not just fringe theories, by the way. These are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend this undemocratic system. And none of them stand up under scrutiny. They are actually myths that do not stand up to facts. So let's bust these myths now. Myth number 1. Without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California and New York. We decided to run through some numbers to see what a direct popular vote would look like. So here we're looking at the 2012 election where Barack Obama won. And by popular vote, he would have needed 63.4 million votes to win. Now, we've lined up all the states. If you can see on the bottom, it's in little tiny print. The biggest population state is on the far left, that's California. And then it goes down in population until over on the right, you have Alaska. So if he needed 63.4 million votes to win, all of the Democratic, what you're seeing here in the first 2 bars, the Barack Obama votes in California and in New York added up to 12,000 votes. 12 million votes. So now if we add, so the first one is just California, and the second one is California plus New York. So each state you're adding on top of that bar. So now if we go through all the bars, now we've gone up to the first 5, and we've got California, New York, Florida, Texas, and Illinois. That still only brings us to 23 million votes. So there's still a long way from him winning. So it actually would take 39 states Democratic votes in order for Barack Obama to have won. So it looks like right around here, New Mexico, just about reaching the bar. So these Democratic votes to the right of where they meet the bar, all right, those are gravy. They're a little bit over what he needed. So there's no way out of all the millions of votes that are cast. And again, back to my numbers from the 2020 election, the total numbers of votes cast in 2020 was 158 million. And people say, well, California's total was 17.5 million. So 17.5 million is a long way from 158 million. And then if you add New York, let's see, what was New York? I'm looking at the numbers here. New York's total was 8.5, a little more than 8.5 million. So 8.5, and what did we say for California? And 17.5, so 25 million. We still have to get up to 158 million votes. So it's such a mathematically impossible situation to imply that a few large states can win an election. And in fact, after seeing these facts about states, believers in the Electoral College will then bring up a similar myth that without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by just a few big cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Once again, statistics tell a different story. These pie charts show the percentage of voting age adults who live in big cities. As seen on the first chart to the left, the combined voting age population of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago is just 5% of the national voting age population. That is certainly not enough to decide an election. So we expanded to the top 10 cities, those with over 1 million residents, and that adds up to just 8% of the voting age population. Even when we went to the 50 biggest cities, they make up just 15% of the voting age population in this country. That's about the same as the size of the rural population. There just aren't enough people living in big cities to decide our president on their own. Most people, 71%, live in smaller towns and suburban areas. It is simply mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states or the largest cities. Once again, direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. So myth number 3, abolishing the Electoral College would only benefit Democratic candidates. Well, to bust this myth, let's look at the 2004 presidential election, the Bush-Kerry election. On the left is the actual map of the results, where George W. Bush won over John Kerry, and he had 3 million more popular votes, so he won the popular vote, and he won the electoral vote. There were 286 electoral votes for Bush and 251 for Kerry. Now, on the right, we made one change of one state. Can you spot it? If John Kerry, it's Ohio. Here, instead of red, Ohio was a swing state. If Ohio, over here on the right, next to Indiana, had gone blue in this hypothetical, all he needed was 119,000 more votes in Ohio. He would have won the Electoral College and the election, even though Bush would still have had nearly 3 million more popular votes. So the fact is that the Electoral College can hurt either of our 2 major political parties. It is a nonpartisan issue. And if this had happened, if Kerry had won Ohio, we wouldn't even be talking about this now because people would realize that it could affect either party. And so the biggest obstacle, I always say, we have people that we're never going to convince. They just feel that they don't want to change things. And then there are people that, maybe are open. They're going to listen to us and hear what we have to say. And maybe we can persuade them. And then we have our friends who believe the Electoral College should be abolished. And they're the biggest heartbreakers sometimes because they say, oh, but an amendment is so hard. Well, that is just plain pessimism. Many people feel that the Electoral College will never be abolished because it would take a constitutional amendment to do it. It's never going to happen, is a comment we hear all too often. What we have to work on is to overcome this defeatism. Here's a timeline showing the dates that all constitutional amendments were ratified. The Bill of Rights, the first 10, is shown with just one bar. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clumps, then another gap of 43 years. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and those of the 50s and 60s, then a gap of 21 years to the 27th Amendment in 1992, and it has been 30 years since then. What distinguishes these periods of constitutional activity? They tended to be periods of great national political activity, where citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis, where the demand for change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the progressive era at the turn of the last century, and the civil rights era in the 50s and 60s. We seem to be in the middle of another period of political activity, of demand for change. Only time will tell, but the level of engagement we are seeing now and the genuine concerns about the resilience of our democracy are remarkable. And don't forget, many of these amendments had to do with electing the president. One of the first ones in 1800, in the early 1801, had to do with changing the Electoral College itself, because the original idea was whoever got the first number of electors would be president, and whoever was the runner-up would be vice president. Well, that was a problem because parties had already formed, and you might have you could have a president who was the, well, let's say in those days, the Federalist, and then you might have the runner-up be the Whig, and they wouldn't get along very well as president, vice president. So they had to change that right away. And then we've added term limits for the president. There were all kinds of amendments having to do with the poll tax and then allowing women to vote, and then 18-year-olds to vote. So we have a lot of amendments that had to do with election and with the president. So what needs to be done? Well, we want the only permanent, long-lasting way is a constitutional amendment. The League does support a technique, a system that people support called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which Illinois had signed on to already in 2008. So we did not the League did not get involved with that decision at that time. And in Illinois here, it's kind of a moot point. So that's why we're progressing on to an amendment as the next step, as is in our position. So abolishing the Electoral College permanently would require an amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, we know that these are hard, but that's the idea. They were supposed to be hard to do, but still a possibility. The founders wrote it into the Constitution. They understood that times would change and that there may need to be changes in the Constitution. And so we have a system in the Constitution that allows us to make changes. So all the amendments that have ever passed so far use this system. There was a proposal that required a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the U.S. Senate. Then it does not require a presidential signature, just the two houses. And then if you can get 2/3 in both houses, then it goes to the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. So right now that's 38 states. So this is not the same thing as a constitutional convention. This is just a straight old amendment, just like the women getting the vote or prohibition or the repeal of prohibition. This is the way that would have to go. All right, that's that. What has happened? Has there been any movement? Well, I told you a little bit about 1968 to 70 when Wallace was running against Nixon in that election. Congress took action between 1969 and 1970 to abolish the Electoral College. Oh, here's what I was telling you about before. I forgot this was at the end. There was a ton of momentum at that time. George Wallace got 46 electoral votes. Democrats and Republicans were worried Humphrey or Nixon might not get the 270 needed. A Gallup poll at the time shows a whopping 81% of Americans supported abolishing the Electoral College, including President Nixon, as a matter of fact. And a bill to amend the Constitution passed the House of Representatives by a margin of 338 to 70, a bipartisan vote. However, it died in the Senate when it was filibustered by Southern Democrats who feared that their states would lose power in presidential elections because of their traditionally low voter turnout. Similar bills have been introduced as recently as 2021, but there has been no vote on those bills. They mostly wind up in the Judicial Committee. We believe this issue lacks momentum because of the defeatist attitude that it's never going to happen. So that's what we need to change. We need momentum. So the League of Women Voters is uniquely positioned to empower voters through education and advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. This is what we do. We engage with voters, provide them with the information and education they need about elections and issues. And then, armed with this education, the League can activate voters to bring this momentum to Congress when the time is right. And now I'll pause there because right now, we all understand that the composition of the House and the Senate at this time is not conducive to passing a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. So the League in this campaign, this nationwide campaign, is focusing on education. So that's what we want to do. We want to educate people with these programs so that when the time comes, that it may become a possibility or a probability or an opportunity to pass an amendment, we will have done our job in educating the public. So right now, if you have someone in your league who would like to start coming, and they call it a task force here, it's not really a task force, it's our Electoral College Committee. We have our monthly meetings on the third Fridays at noon on Zoom. And for a while we had some speakers, and now we're doing a little more with training our members because we really want to train speakers to go out and give this presentation. And if you have some organizations in your state or locally that would be allies in this, we're looking to activate supporters and give the presentation wherever we can so that people are familiar with the idea, are comfortable with the idea, feel like they know something about the idea. But mostly, the main thing that I always say is to keep it on the conversation on the front burner. One of the problems, as you know, over the years, is that whenever there's an election, and especially in some of the elections where the Electoral College result was different than the popular vote, there's a flurry of concern and activity, and then it kind of fades in the background. And that's been a problem. So we really want to keep the discussion about the Electoral College on the front, in the forefront of people's interest among those who are interested in government and civics. We would love to enroll you in training and have you give this presentation to your civic groups or college and university groups. And the brochures, which Anne distributed either on email as a PDF or in actual paper. We have lots of those, and use that information to educate your friends and neighbors. On the right here, there are some graphics that are going to be created. They still haven't done them yet. We're hoping to have more posters and things that could be posted on Facebook. And we didn't get around to abolishing the Electoral Day on January 6th. I think that there might have been a decision. This might not have been the year to do that, but I think that would be a cool idea for the future. And watch for action alerts from LWV. So that's it. Thank you so much. If you're interested in joining our group, our email that I just set up an email for the group. It's abolishelectoral@gmail.com. So it's pretty easy to remember. As a local league, you can choose someone to represent you, or most of our members are not official representatives of their leagues. They're just interested league members who come. And some people are on our mailing list and they never show up, but they just like to keep up on what we're doing. So that would be fine also. You can also start to identify people that might support this in the future, because don't forget, if we ever have the chance where it gets through the two houses, then there'll be battles in all the states to get 38 states. So it's not unreasonable to think you might want to educate local government officials as well. So thank you very much, and I will end this.